inventor, an innovator, a catalyst for change. I will build a motor car for the multitudes, he said. And Henry Ford did just that. His Model T, the Tin Lizzie, was an instant success when it debuted in October 1908. Within a few months, it was the best-selling car in the world.
He wanted to be able to produce automobiles that were efficient and reliable, and he wanted to do it at a cost that could put them within the reach of the average working man. Now, there were two problems here. First of all, the average working man in the United States didn't make enough money around the turn of the century, the early part of the century, to buy an automobile of any kind. The second problem was that the Industrial Revolution had not yet produced a system that would allow you to manufacture something as complicated as an automobile and keep costs down the way Ford wanted. One of his greatest accomplishments was to accomplish both of these things at once. It's often thought that his revolutionary idea was the assembly line. Well, in fact, the assembly line had existed in various forms before. I think just as important was in his realization that if you paid wages that were much higher than the prevailing rate at the time, you were going to create a market for the very goods that you were producing.
Ford shared his profits with his workers and raised the minimum wage at his factories to $5 per day, more than double the average rate for the industry. Many of his fellow capitalists were furious with him for setting such radical precedents, but Ford knew that more pay would eventually mean more buyers for Ford cars. By 1927, 15.5 million Fords had been sold in America, and the automobile had become a mainstay of the economy. We learned new words: traffic, rush hour, speed limit. New highways crisscrossed the country, changing the look of the land forever.
Henry Ford's principal contributions to the 20th century were putting a good face on capitalism, making the Industrial Revolution work. He had a great influence in elevating what was then called the working class into what was then, and probably still is now, considered the middle class, making it possible for people to have the kinds of aspirations that have contributed to an unprecedented period of stability and prosperity in this country.
While Henry Ford was polishing the image of capitalism, this man was preaching global revolution against it. Vladimir Lenin set into motion the deepest ideological conflict of the 20th century.
Lenin was a true revolutionary. He was educated and raised in the hotbed of anarchy and resentment that was percolating through the mostly educated classes in Tsarist Russia in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. He had every reason to build up tremendous resentments toward everything that smacked of privilege and the old ways of doing things.
Lenin's revolutionary career began after his older brother was executed for plotting against Tsar Alexander III. He began to read the German philosopher Karl Marx, who believed that capitalism was doomed and socialism inevitable. Marx said economic and social equality would take place when the proletariat, the working class, revolts against the capitalists who enslave them. Lenin plotted to realize that vision, first in Russia and then in the entire world. He spent over 4 years in jail and exile for his revolutionary activities. In 1903, he began urging his followers to overthrow the Tsarist regime and install Marx's revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the government would own all property. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power from the moderate regime that had ousted the Tsar that March. In the name of the councils of workers and soldiers, the Soviets, Lenin became premier of Russia. He had masterminded the first communist coup.
created a climate of fear and suspicion that, while it didn't seem to be excessive at the time, if you extended that into the future, as Stalin did, it became one of the most dreadful and dreadfully inefficient systems for organizing human endeavor this century has seen. It was Lenin who created the modern Soviet Union. You can't blame him for everything that it's evolved into, but it would not be the way it is without him. And as a result, the two major superpowers, the two countries that have dominated the 20th century, have existed in mutual hostility and incomprehension. Because of Lenin, the world has missed a terrific opportunity, an opportunity that I hope now we'll finally be able to seize.
Pablo Picasso was once asked, "What is art?" He answered, "What is not?" He proved his point with an incredibly prolific outpouring of paintings, sketches, sculptures, pottery, lithographs, mosaics, murals, and even literature. In his lifetime, Picasso became the highest paid artist in the world and the most popular. He was known to almost everybody on every level of understanding. His work is a one-man history of modern art. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, completed in 1907, marked the beginning of Cubism, an imaginative way of fragmenting visual reality on canvas. But Picasso was much more than a cubist. He taught us to see art and reality in a new way, alive, vibrant, and accessible. Time magazine said, "Seizing nature by the hair, he joyously twists, tears, chops, stretches, and mauls her to create new faces never before shown to mortal men." What is a human face? Asked Picasso. Who sees it correctly? The photographer, the mirror, or the painter? Are we to paint what's on her face, what's inside the face, or what's behind it? Picasso, the artist, possessed a voluminous energy and a volcanic imagination. Among his masterpieces, Guernica, painted to protest the fascist destruction of a small town during the Spanish Civil War. A simpler and more direct expression of his political passion was his Dove of Peace. Picasso, the man, had it all. Marriages, affairs, children, estates, millions of dollars, global fame. He was a man constantly in love with art, with women, and with life.
Vous aimez bien les gens?
J'aime beaucoup les gens.
Tout le monde?
Et si on n'aurait pas de chance, je sais pas qui j'aimerais même un bouton de porte, n'est-ce pas, un pot de chambre, n'importe quoi.
It's a remarkable thing about Picasso that his art is great and at the same time accessible. If you're untrained in what makes great art, you can still enjoy and appreciate just about everything that he did. You have a sense that he was enjoying the creation of this art. This is not a man who is going to cut off his ear. Unmistakably, the worst historical monster we've had was Adolf Hitler. Any way you measure evil, the number of people who died as a direct result of his dreadfulness, the cost in terms of suffering, bloodshed, pernicious ideas introduced into public discourse, fear, terror, personal depravity. He fits the bill. He overfulfills his quota in every category. His direct role in the Holocaust, the lies, the perfidy, his role in debasing the notion of democracy and statehood. We're still trying to deal with what he did.
Diesem Deutschland Dienst tut, wird heute Deutschland in stolzer Freude seine Söhne in euch marschieren sehen.
Hitler played on the fears and bitter humiliations the German people felt from their defeat in World War I. He promised a new Germany, a Third Reich that would rule the world and last 1,000 years. He raised their hopes with emotional speeches, punctuated with grandiose gestures, copied from a Munich beer hall comedian. To set the stage for his conquest of Europe, Hitler forged alliances with fellow dictators in Italy and Spain. He absorbed the Rhineland, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. After protecting his eastern flank through an infamous alliance with the Soviet Union, Hitler and his immense military machine invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Hitler had plunged mankind into the pivotal event of our century, World War II. In April 1940, he crushed Norway and Denmark, and a month later, swept into Western Europe to attack Belgium, Holland, France, and England. The Dutch surrendered in 5 days. Belgium in 18. France fell in 6 weeks. Hitler took a particular joy in imposing the same humiliating surrender on the French that Germany had suffered in World War I. He even insisted on signing the armistice in the same railroad car that had been used 22 years earlier. Meanwhile, the demolished, disheartened Allied army was miraculously plucked from the French coast by a ragtag armada in the miracle of Dunkirk.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin.
If Adolf Hitler was the unacceptable face of evil in World War II, Winston Churchill was the admirable face of heroism. When it appeared certain that the combined might of Nazi Germany was going to strike at the very cliffs of Dover, it was Churchill who first of all convinced his countrymen that they could do it, that they could survive, that they had the spirit and the stamina and the courage to stand alone against the most terrifying military machine ever invented.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its commonwealths last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Churchill's major gift was that he could persuade and he could inspire. Alone among 20th century politicians, he owned the language.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
He was prone to fits of melancholy. He drank a little too much. He cried a lot. He suffered deeply. But his public face was irrepressible, burbling with energy and optimism. And after all, what is a great public person but somebody who can project the perfect image for the occasion? Nobody's done that as well as Winston Churchill did.
The tide began to turn as British troops defeated the Axis in North Africa in May 1941. And when Hitler turned on his former Soviet ally, his troops met the combined resistance of the Red Army and the Russian winter. But the decisive blow came after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, when the United States entered the war. Within 19 months, the Allies were back on the European mainland, and by June 6, 1944, D-Day, Hitler's days were clearly numbered. Churchill had kept his promise.
Nothing is more certain than that every trace of Hitler's footsteps, every stain of his infected and corroding fingers will be sponged and purged and, if need be, blasted from the surface of the earth.
Hitler's last days were spent in hiding. An observer described the man who had once terrorized the world as a dead soul, a living corpse, gobbling cream puffs and mumbling regrets. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. His legacy was not a 1,000-year Reich, but a world in ruins. Not a master race, but the deaths of over 35 million souls, including the systematic annihilation of 6 million Jews.
Hitler's contribution was to make evil thinkable, was to pull the world into an orgy of destructiveness, the likes of which it had never seen before, hasn't seen since. God help us, we'll never see it again.
World War II ended with the awesome proof of a remarkable theory. His studies of the smallest particles of matter were the doorway to the nuclear age. His view of the cosmos completely altered our perception of the universe, with new concepts of light, motion, gravitation, energy, time, space, and their relation to each other. Albert Einstein was the preeminent scientific genius of the 20th century, perhaps of all time. He said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible." In 1905, when he was 26, Einstein wrote a series of 4 papers that began the most sweeping scientific advance in history. In one, he explained the movement of molecules. In another, he revolutionized the theory of light. In the third, he expanded on a paper he wrote at age 16, describing the relationship of time and motion. And in the fourth, he expressed this special theory of relativity in a formula that says that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. The formula showed that even a tiny atom could yield an enormous quantity of energy. In 1916, Einstein perfected his general theory of relativity, which held that gravity is not a force, as Newton believed, but merely a curve caused by mass in the continuum of space and time in which every object exists. These astounding ideas have helped us to understand the origin of the universe, the power of the sun, and the movement of electrons.
We now think about science as something akin to philosophy. The dimension that Einstein has given thought in this century is simply that there are no boundaries to human inquiry.
In 1933, soon after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Einstein renounced his German citizenship and accepted a full-time position with the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton University. He also continued to speak out forcefully in favor of social causes and in opposition to the use of nuclear weapons, although he had at first encouraged atomic bomb research. Indeed, he always recognized the ephemeral nature of the human condition. Politics are for the moment, he said. An equation is for eternity. In the 20th century, our boundaries have also expanded inward. In the first decade of our century, a 37-year-old doctor in Vienna published his studies in hypnosis, which led to another fundamental transformation of our understanding. Sigmund Freud and a colleague discovered that through hypnosis, mental patients were able to relive the experiences at the root of their illnesses, and by bringing the resulting emotions into the open, they were able to relieve and even cure their disorders. Freud then replaced hypnosis with a technique of free association, creating a process that he called psychoanalysis. Freud showed that the unconscious mind, particularly our unconscious reaction to sexual stimuli when we're very young, governs much of our lives. At a time when sex was rarely mentioned in polite society, his work was met with hostility and was denounced by prominent members of the medical community. The eventual recognition that mental illness could be treated gave meaningful life to millions who previously might have been locked away and forgotten. Freud raised scientific questions about our behavior that had until then been the exclusive province of literature, religion, and philosophy. What drives us? What are we afraid of? How do we affect the lives of our children? Freud was the first person to interpret dreams on a scientific basis, pointing out that dreams are often attempts to fulfill wishes hidden in the subconscious mind. He said the mind is an iceberg. It floats with only 1/7 of its bulk above water.
One of the things that sets us apart from our fellow animals is this curiosity about why things happen and about why we do the things that we do. If Freud hadn't come along, we might have forgotten that. We might have neglected that side of our character. And as a result, I think the world would be a much flatter and less interesting place to live.
The spiritual life of our planet was further elevated by a man who taught us the power of peace. Mohandas Gandhi preached satyagraha, the force of righteousness. His pursuit of peaceful resistance was a remarkable revolutionary concept, a concept that eventually freed India from British colonial rule. Though he never held public office, Gandhi bound together more than 400 million people in his cause. Winston Churchill called him a seditious half-naked fakir, while Albert Einstein said he was the most enlightened of all the political men of our time. Gandhi's primary weapon was non-violent protest. He toured India, at first preaching renunciation of imported fabrics. If everyone in India will spin their own cloth, he said, we can be economically free. The spinning wheel became Gandhi's and India's symbol of spiritual salvation and independence.
Gandhi's genius to recognize that he could appeal over the heads of his adversaries to public opinion at large, that he could mobilize forces that previous leaders didn't realize existed to serve his ends, that he could embarrass a great colonial power without firing a single shot, and that's what he did.
Gandhi preached love, truth, and civil disobedience. His tactic was to refuse taxes, to disavow the legal system, and disciples by the millions followed his example. Repeatedly arrested, he spent a total of 12 years in jail, saying, I always get the best bargains from behind iron bars. He fasted to the brink of death to win concessions from the British. The people called him the Mahatma, the great soul. Worldwide attention focused on this tiny, cunning man in the loincloth. Finally, on August 15, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, Britain's last viceroy, recognized India's independence. Gandhi had won.
In this country, the person who grasped Gandhi's lesson and used it most effectively was Martin Luther King Jr. Before Martin Luther King came along, there had not been an awful lot of progress in assuring equality among the races in this country.
King was the son of a preacher and a minister himself. He began his crusade for black equality from a pulpit in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The issue, a black boycott of Montgomery's segregated buses.
We, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, have been involved in a non-violent protest against the injustices which we have experienced on the buses for a number of years. This is a non-violent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces, using the method of passive resistance.
After 1 year and 16 days, marked by bombings and violent attacks on Montgomery's black community, the courts ruled in favor of desegregation. King had scored his first major victory.
We are not going back pushing anybody over. We are not going back to the buses bragging about a victory being won. This will be the defeat of everything that we've done for the last 12 months.
Behind King, the civil rights movement widened and deepened. King told Americans, "Your moral progress lags behind your scientific progress. Your mentality outshines your morality. Your civilization outshines your culture." News coverage of police brutality in Birmingham and Selma, Alabama, focused national attention on civil rights. Thousands of blacks and whites joined King on a campaign for voter registration. Sit-in campaigns and demonstrations erupted across the nation. While preaching nonviolence, King was beaten and stabbed. He was put in jail 17 times. August 1963, more than 200,000 demonstrators answered King's call for a massive civil rights march on Washington. At the Lincoln Memorial, his powerful evangelical oratory evokes a vision that will become the century's most memorable rallying cry for racial equality.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Slowly, painfully, Martin Luther King's dream began to come true. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In time, the entire fabric of legal segregation would unravel. But his accomplishments cannot be measured only in legislative advances. They're also measured in the civilizing impact he had on the American conscience and on the world.
One by one, the totalitarian regimes of Eastern Europe and even a few in the developing world are tumbling. And if you go to these countries and ask the people who are leading these revolutions where they got their ideas, some of them will tell you Thomas Jefferson, others will say Abraham Lincoln, but quite a few will say that the man who in the 20th century did what they have been trying to do was Martin Luther King Jr.
Long before his work was finished, King was assassinated by a white gunman in Memphis, Tennessee. In a bitter coincidence, he met the same fate as the man after whom he had patterned much of his life. Mahatma Gandhi was shot by a Hindu extremist less than 6 months after Indian independence.
We decided not to define spiritual life narrowly. It obviously has to include the realm of music. As we began to examine the people who have shaped popular music in the world, one figure stood out, one man who combines artistic ability, undeniable genius, and a certain seriousness that transcends the notion of pop music. And that's John Lennon. He, first of all, is the outstanding figure in the single most popular and influential group of musicians in this century, the Beatles.
Time said, they're leading an evolution in which the best of current post-rock sounds are becoming something that pop music has never been before. an art form. The most committed artist, the most elastic wit, and the most controversial of the Beatles was John Lennon.
And, put them in context. Well, I can't. It was a long time ago, but I just didn't mean what everybody thinks I meant, you know. I'm not anti-Christ or anti-religion.
The influence of the Beatles went far beyond music. Their explosion of remarkable songs about love and loneliness, war and economics, politics and protest was a catalyst in the transformation of an entire generation. Even after the breakup of the Beatles, Lennon remained an almost mythic public figure with a simple message, a celebration of love, domesticity, and peace.
Just show me one militant revolution that worked. That's including Russia and France and all the places that have revolutions. All the intentions were good, maybe, but what happened? They just get another establishment who do exactly the same. And nobody's ever tried it peacefully except for people like Gandhi.
He could write biting satire. But at the same time, he never lost this sense that the world is a pretty nice place. He wanted to give peace a chance. He was the guy who told us that I hope someday you will join us and the world will live as one. And you know, I think a lot of people listen to that message. Maybe, just maybe, one of the reasons that the Berlin Wall has fallen, that countries around the world are starting to adopt more humane ways of organizing their governments and their economies, is that great masses of people had transistor radios, had cassette decks. They heard the message John Lennon was telling them, that the world can be a better place if only you'll have the faith that things are going to get better. Who knows? Imagine